too. So oops, me talking about to see people attending. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining this busy open access week. Have you guys attended any other webinars?
No, I haven't heard of anything.
I was speaking in one yesterday.
Okay.
Day before, maybe. I don't know. It's open access week. It all kind of merges into one.
Have you had any other events, Sarah?
No, but I was asked to speak actually on a few other webinars, and I just said one this week is enough for me.
Oh, thank you.
Going on too. So this one, yeah, this was the one I chose to do.
We did plan this 127 days ago, didn't we?
It feels like 6 months at least. Yeah, it was.
I know.
It's a while in the making.
A lot of the time is sometimes spent just organizing a date and speakers, and then last year I learned a lesson that if you do it early on, people are still free and there's less debate about it. So I have to look into next year soon. I haven't done that yet, just plan till the end of the year. Yeah, we'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Still see people coming on. It's only just past the hour here. All right, I think we'll get started just now. I make it just past 3 o'clock and we're going to stick to the hour. Don't really ever go over because I know time is precious. So thanks everyone for joining me today in this Kronos Hub webinar on getting to open, where we'll talk about different ways to achieve open access, look at different models on how to do that. My name is Romy Beard. I'm the head of publisher relations here at Kronos Hub, which is an open access management platform, and we work with publishers, funders and institutions. So I'm particularly excited about the variety we have on the panel today with our 4 guest speakers. We'll have Vanessa Jaite, who's a researcher from the University of Bern, who will kick us off by giving her perspectives on open access and the struggles as a researcher. Then we'll hand over to Arthur A.J. Boston from Murray State University about his new proposed model, Read and Let Read. Before handing over to Sarah Bossart from the Royal Society of Chemistry, we'll talk about how the RSC is planning to achieve fully OA by 2028. Yes. And Chris Pym from the American Chemical Society, as a role who manages different funder relations, will give us a bit of a funder perspective and funder mandates and how publishers are responding to that. Just a bit of housekeeping first. We're recording this webinar, so there's no need to take lots of notes, and we'll make the slides available and we'll share the recording on our website and email it out to anyone who has registered and or is attending. And there's a chat and a Q&A, so please feel free to use it during the presentation. So our format for today, if you haven't been to any of my webinars, we'll have some short presentations, about 8 minutes for each speaker before we move into the discussion. And then during the discussion is usually when the questions appear, so I'll try and weave them into the conversation. So please post them as and when they pop into your head, and we'll try and get to them. And then we do a little close at the end, looking at what's next and what are the key points. So first of all, we'll have Vanessa who'll share her researcher perspective.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Romy, for inviting me to this webinar. It's really exciting to talk about this because this is something I think a lot of researchers sort of think about and obviously deal with. Sometimes we talk about it in a coffee break, but it's something I felt really passionate about for a long time and haven't really found anybody who shares that passion until I met you guys at Kronos Hub. But really, I think my journey into open access started with a major frustration when I got an email one day a couple of years ago from the lawyers of a big publishing house, I probably should not mention it, saying that they had taken down a paper of mine from ResearchGate because I had violated some rules. And I wrote to the editor of that journal, I know him, and said, what the hell is going on? This was a 2-year embargo. It's 5 years after publication. Why are they taking it down? And he couldn't tell me, and he contacted all sorts of people at the journal, and they couldn't tell me either. And I wrote several very angry emails to those lawyers and never got a reply. So I was really angry and said, that's it, no more hybrid journals for me. And then was lucky enough to start working with a funder that actually requires a gold open access, or they allow hybrid or green open access, but they won't pay for it. So when I first started working with them, a situation I got into was that I was invited to publish my research in a special issue of a journal that would have been really good for me to publish in because it's well respected in the field. And it would have been good for me to publish with the people who invited me, but it was a hybrid journal, and so I didn't have any funds to pay for the open access fee. So I contacted Kronos Hub actually to ask what my options were for staying funder compliant. And Laura advised me. She was amazing. She told me things that I had no idea about. And it made me realize that even though our funders have these requirements, often we have no clue, first of all, what they really mean. And secondly, how can you go about it? And that there are many more options than we're aware of. So Laura told me that the university I was affiliated with at the time actually had an agreement with that journal. And so I could contact this person. She even found out who the person was at the library, and ask whether they had any, I think it was like a limited number of licenses or papers, whether they had any left for that year. And I did. And in fact, they did have 3 licenses. But my advisor at the time felt that it was not fair if someone like me, who was only associated as a postdoc and who wasn't a student or a proper staff member, would take one of those spots. And so she advised me not to publish the paper. And so I never did. And I sort of didn't think much of it until this summer when I went to a conference and met the person who invited me to the special issue. And he told me he was still feeling sad that I never published that paper. So yeah, there's that. I think it's really great that my funder is pushing for open access, gold open access. I really resonate with their reasoning that publicly funded research should be accessible to the public immediately and free of charge. I have a very strong concordance with that. I think some of the issues around gold open access, especially for me, because I work with people in low-income countries and developing countries, I think for them, it's much harder to cover those APCs. And if you don't have a funder who covers it, even in a developed country, it's difficult or impossible to do. So I think there's definitely that issue, and I think some of our other speakers will probably mention that later, cover that point. But I think another issue with it is that, or ways in which gold open access can be limiting, is that sometimes the best journals in the field are not gold open access, or you have high impact research, but you have no high impact gold open access journals. Or the only ones that you have available are considered predatory by other researchers. And so then you're kind of in a difficult bind on what to do. And I think it gets even more tricky when you have collaborators or co-authors who don't see the value of open access, but they might have very clear career goals, milestones, and so they just want to publish in high impact journals, or possibly even in some of those predatory journals, because often they have a quicker turnaround, so it means you get the publications out quicker. So then what do you do? My funder pays for APCs, even if I'm the 75th author, which is great, but sometimes people just don't want to publish in those journals. So I am actually on the board of a postdoc network of who we all have the same funder, and I asked around what things people would like me to bring in today. So I got a few statements from them, which I thought I could share with you. And one of them said, the biggest struggle is still publishing high impact while following the open access rules. Unfortunately, the US in my field doesn't care about open access, so no one's willing to pay for the fee when it's a hybrid journal. So to make it very specific, I have high impact material now, but when I put the SNF as a funder, I can't go high impact. So as much as I think open access is necessary and should be mandatory for everyone, it feels currently like a disadvantage having funding from the SNF. And then someone else said to that, ultimately the SNF is just putting the financial burden for open access publishing to other collaborators, since people will still want to publish in this or that prestigious journal, but they'll have to try and find other funding to getting it into those journals, rather than going with something slightly off topic or something less prestigious. I'll just have to see, because there was a lot of similar sentiments, people saying, I would really want to or need to publish in certain journals, but I can't because it's not funder compliant, or in order to be compliant, I would have to put people on my papers that don't really fulfill the requirements, the scientific requirements for being an author. So I think in the most extreme case, the gold open access requirement can put people in a place where they'll put authors on their paper that can pay for it, even though they shouldn't be on the paper. I think also in terms of this issue of the lower income countries or people who don't have funders who pay for it, this could lead to some unsound scientific practices. But that's really I think in the most extreme case. Someone else was saying, I'm still figuring all of this out. My research is funded through several sources in addition to my fellowship. It seems that for NIH-funded research, there's a manuscript deposit system. So even though one of my papers was recently accepted in a hybrid journal, and I thought we had agreed we would pay the immediate open access fee, it turns out we don't need to do that. The manuscript will be accessible on the NIH manuscript platform. I think I might face new challenges with my next publication when there is a co-author from the CBC, one step at a time. So I think this also really shows that there's still a lot of confusion for a lot of researchers, particularly early career researchers like myself, and it's super handy to have people like you guys from Kronos who can help us find a way through this jungle. And I just hope that enough researchers actually know about these tools and can access them. Yeah, I think I might leave it at that for now, and then come back to some of this.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. yeah, still a lot of confusion with a lot of different models and not knowing where to look and what's the best option. And, you know, just to make you a little bit more confused, I bring to you AJ Boston with his new proposed model, read and let read. So, you know, I'll be interested to hear what you think about this, Vanessa. It's all yours.
All right. Well, thanks, Romy. Appreciate that introduction. I was really glad we were able to put Vanessa up front on this call. Librarians, publishers, funders, we all have a stake in this system, but it's really researchers who are at the center and having to deal with this head on. So I'm glad we can kind of center this conversation with Vanessa and those anecdotes she was able to share. So let's go ahead and move on to the first slide, please. Happy Open Access Week, everyone. I'm AJ Boston. I'm a scholarly communication librarian and associate professor at Murray State University, located in Western Kentucky. I have been an open access advocate for the past 7 years. I've served on committees, given presentations, and published writings all about open access. And so having said that, I'm delighted to be able to tell you about my proposal for getting us to open, which is through subscriptions. All right, so let's move to the next slide, please. And, oh, we'll go back one. Perfect, thank you. So as back school, it's a teaching first regional comprehensive. My perspective may be a bit different from other librarians on these topics who work at more research intensive institutions. But even for a school like mine, which has just under 10,000 students, we do a decent amount of work towards open. I help our faculty deposit green copies of their articles. I help run 5 faculty Diamond OA journals, and we support 5 other open Diamond OA journals through Lyrasis' open access community investment program. One of our distinguished alum has funded a small OA award that we give out annually. And the only thing we really don't do in terms of open access is help to pay open access fees. From my perspective, even if we did start a read and publish deal with every publisher that offers them, Murray State would still fall short of complete open access. And I think the same is true for a lot of places. And that's not a criticism of current paths. It's just my assessment that there's more work to be done. Right, moving on to the next slide. The growing number of current open publishing routes do all add up to a much more complete picture of openness, closer to full open access than ever before. Even so, there are still plenty of gaps to be filled, and I believe libraries are in the best position to mortar in those gaps. To start, libraries are an equal partner with publishers in creating and maintaining a paywalled system of scholarly communication. Publishers charge for access, but it's libraries that pay the charges, justifying the existence of paywalled content. The other thing to keep in mind is that as more and more articles become open access, the value of our subscriptions decreases. And as that devaluation continues, it's either going to mean that libraries will stick with a bad deal, which is bad for libraries, or they'll just cancel that subscription altogether, which is bad for publishers. Or a third scenario is that paywall journals simply shift fees from readers to authors, which is bad for underfunded or underaffiliated authors, like the examples that Vanessa shared with us. All right, moving on to the next slide. So with those thoughts in mind, I propose a model that I've been calling Read and Let Read. Read and Let Read is a revision of the subscription model for multi-journal publishers. The first part of this model is the read portion. Rather than libraries picking and choosing individual titles to subscribe to each year, the publisher would simply make their entire portfolio available to users of a partnered library. And rather than pay some arbitrary rate, the publishers would charge the library according to the number of times that paywalled articles get used. The library would pay for their uses in advance each year based on how many articles they used in the past year. And to protect against users running out of prepaid uses, the library would pay for double of what it actually expects to use. Consequently, we can expect the library to have many prepaid article uses left over at the end of each year. And this is where the let read part of the model comes into play. Every prepaid article usage that goes unused by the library's community will be made available to anyone on the web. You're familiar with news websites offering non-subscribers some limited number of free reads each month. Or you may even be familiar with JSTOR's program, which lets users create accounts and then read up to 100 free articles per month. I don't know what the economics are behind that JSTOR program, but under the read and let read model, all of those free uses would be paid for. So to put this into more concrete terms, if a major publisher were to test out a pilot of read and let read, they could work with a small number of libraries, perhaps a consortium of academic libraries in Kentucky. They would sit down, look at what these schools are already paying, how many articles they're using, then kind of work backwards to come up with that per article rate. These libraries would no longer subscribe to the publisher's individual journals, but would instead receive access to all of that publisher's paywalled articles. The libraries would pay for what they access, and additionally give global users a roughly equal amount of access. If this deal were implemented and it entered into its optimized stage, then there should never be any article that is unavailable to anyone who clicks to read it. Lastly, because each use of an article represents a particular dollar amount, it should be possible to track how much has been paid towards each article on the back end. And once an article has received payments in sum that are equivalent to an article processing charge, articles could be made automatically open access once they reach that target. So in my opinion, that's a pretty collaborative approach to funding open access. Next slide. So this deal, I believe, would provide value to libraries, sustainability to publishers, and fill in access gaps that exist in our current array of open access offerings. The equity portion of this is pretty big because the ability to read an article is no longer contingent upon a deal brokered through an elite institution. It could get messy in practice, but in theory, it's equitable, accessible, and sustainable all in one. Under-affiliated users would be able to read paywalled content. Under-affiliated authors would not have to worry about being read less if they are unable to go open access. Library users would get access to everything from a publisher without delay, and the publisher would get paid for all of it. Next slide. So this idea has evolved quite a bit from when I first presented it at a small conference 3 years ago. If you'd like to think more about read and let read at your leisure, take a screenshot of this slide, which lists 3 select readings on the proposal. And on that note, thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks, AJ. I'm going to have to ask 1 or 2 questions before we hand over. Sorry.
Sure.
One is, you don't pay to publish, if we're talking about the publishing part here, right, as an author. But what does it mean for scenarios like Vanessa if you are funded by, let's say, the SNSF, who has a funding mandate that you need to publish OA immediately? How would that be possible?
So I think this works on top of all the other paths we have forward. So if you have a read and publish deal, or your funder is willing to pay an APC, go ahead and do it, pay for it, make it open access immediately. And that will help take burden off the system of, I mean, that's taking one article out of the equation of paywalled articles that other people don't have to worry about paying to access anymore. So it's completely compatible. So
this would be just for the remaining paywalled articles.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be more questions from the rest of the panel later for you, but just now I'll hand over to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Rami, and hi everyone who's joining us today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you to talk about how we're going to get to a fully open access future. And as AJ mentioned, happy Open Access Week to everyone. As Romy mentioned at the start, my name is Sarah Boshart, and I'm the head of open access journals at the Royal Society of Chemistry, where I look after our open access journal portfolio and also open access more broadly across the organization, including our transition to fully open access. So I'm here today representing the RSC, but also slightly more broadly, the publisher perspective, as we discuss how various groups within the scholarly communications landscape can work together and in fact really need to work together if we're going to be moving towards a fully open access future. Next slide, please, Romy. So just a little bit about the Royal Society of Chemistry. We are a membership society serving the chemistry community. We develop professional capabilities and we bring people together really to spark new ideas and partnerships. We also support teachers to inspire future generations of scientists, and we speak up to influence the people making decisions that affect us all. And really, our purpose as a society is to help the chemical science community to make the world a better place. So as part of this, we publish 56 journals spanning the chemical sciences, and our journals are really mission-driven and serve our community by providing a vehicle through which knowledge can be created and shared. Next slide, please, Romy. And certainly I believe this, and as a society, is sort of one of the best ways to ensure that everyone everywhere can read and benefit from the research is through open access, which is really a key part of why we committed this time last year to transitioning our entire RSC-owned journal portfolio to open access by 2028. Of course, this isn't happening in isolation. There is, as we're talking about, a general shift in the scholarly communications landscape, much more towards open access. We are seeing, and I'm sure Chris will get into this, more and more funders globally starting to mandate immediate open access to the funders they fund. And since authors like Vanessa, of course, are at the core of what we do, we really need to adapt to ensure that we can accommodate these author needs. So the OA movement is not new. It has been going on for decades. But we've definitely seen more recently an acceleration in the pace of change. And personally, I think it's really exciting because I think right now the question is no longer really if we're going to be open access, but when and sort of how are we going to get there. So next slide, please, Robin. And I think the how is, of course, the hard part, hence the session today. But as Arthur touched upon, as Vanessa as well, there's lots of different ways to get to open access. So of course, there's several born open access publishers like PLOS, Frontiers, MDPI that are already there, but even they're grappling with ways to best support their authors, particularly right now in an environment where, as we've already touched upon, author-facing charges are being challenged. Are they fair? Are they introducing a new structure of inequality, effectively cutting off certain authors from the potential to publish? So that's really something we need to get into, and we are sort of as an industry. Meanwhile, the rest of us sort of subscription publishers are trying to figure out how do we transition our subscription journal portfolio to fully open access, and how do we do this sustainably is very different sort of publisher to publisher. It's a very different proposition for some of the larger publishers versus some of the smaller society publishers. And I think because of this, we've seen quite a bit of experimentation with new models in the industry. I enjoyed hearing about AJ's model, so that's a new one for me. But I think although there is coming in quite a bit of complexity and sort of the nuance of the models, I would say most of them can sort of roughly be broken down into sort of the three types that I've illustrated here. So one of the models that's really gaining popularity is this Diamond Open Access model. Normally in this model, you would have sort of 1 to 2 or sort of a limited pool of funds, either from funders, universities, or publishers, as sort of AJ touched upon before. His university has a few Diamond OA journals. We at the RSC have our flagship journal, Chemical Science, is Diamond Open Access, meaning that we cover the costs of running the journal. And what's great about the model from the community perspective is that, of course, anyone can then read and publish in the journal without any charges. So it is a really great model if there are funds available to support it, but it's often not scalable, particularly in our instance, since the revenue generated from other journals are used to support chemical science. So in some ways, there's a limit to the scalability of Diamond Open Access. Another model that's gaining traction with some smaller society publishers and some HSS publishers, and also recently De Gruyter announced that they're going to be going with Subscribe to Open for their portfolio. I won't go into it in too much detail because there's quite a lot of a lot of complication within S2O, but at the heart of it, it's really a community action model where if enough libraries subscribe to the journal each year, the journal is then made open access. And in a similar way to Diamond OA, the community can then read and publish in the journal without charges. Then lastly, we have what's the most popular route just in terms of volume, which is sort of via transformative agreements. So like Subscribe to Open, these agreements are at the institutional level, and they aim to support both reading and publishing in journals, particularly as they transition between a subscription state and then that sort of fully open access state. Next slide, please, Rami. So at the RSC, we've been taking sort of that transformative agreement route initially, and we now have agreements with over 1,000 institutions worldwide, supporting authors to publish in our hybrid journals. But because these agreements are transitional, we need to really figure out what types of model are going to support our journal portfolio where we flip it to 100% open access. So that's really one of the key focuses for us in the next couple of years. So how are we going to become fully open access? We have really sort of two main goals to achieve this. The first, of course, for us is to ensure that we can remain financially sustainable through the transition. All of the many activities that we do as a society are largely dependent on our publishing revenues. And so we really want to make sure that we can both continue to publish our journals and serve our journal communities, and then more broadly that we can support our community and our mission sort of through the work we do as a society. And then equally important, and this goes back to some of what Vanessa was saying at the beginning, is really to ensure that all of our authors can continue to publish in our journals as we transition them to open access. So I mentioned earlier that author-facing charges can often be a barrier to publication. And so we do want to work towards a future where the burden of payment is not on the author. Next slide, please. So to do this, we've sort of broken down our roadmap for the next couple of years into kind of three main parts. We're spending the first few years really working with our global subscribers to understand the types of future model, particularly open access models that will work for them, what are their challenges, and really how can we help them work around those challenges. Simultaneously, we're feeding this information into some early modeling that we're doing and working with some key partners to start to develop some pilot models to trial over the next few years. And we'll be using then those pilot models to sort of test what works and what doesn't in different regions. So then we can inform the development of our future models to support us when we do transition to that 100% open access state. And what's really key, and I think what we already know from some of the early work that we've been doing, is that one size is not going to fit all. We have a very globally diverse author community, and the countries that we serve all have different requirements and different resources when it comes to open access, and also different viewpoints. So if we're going to be achieving this fully open access future, it's really only going to be by working across multiple stakeholder groups, having conversations like the one we're having today, where we hear from librarians, from researchers, from other publishers. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here today and to pick up some more of this in the discussion towards the end.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we'll go straight to Chris to finish us off with the presentations.
Thanks, Rami. Next slide, please. Just while that's clicking over, I'll introduce myself just by saying that I've been working in open access for both fully open access publishers and hybrid open access publishers for about the last decade, primarily working with institutions and research funders on both open access and the wider open science. So Rami's asked me along today to talk about what funders are doing and how they are trying to transition scholarly communications from its very long-term historical state of subscription-based approaches, going back to the very, very early days of philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, to a future where it isn't just the ivory tower that is able to access the output of research. But why do funders care? I mean, I think that's always a decent place to start with any kind of question, is what's driving it. And we've already heard a lot of these comments from Vanessa, from AJ, and from Sarah around what is it about open access that is desirable. And there's a lot that's desirable. I think the ethical argument was the first one to be won, that if the public have paid for something, the public probably should be able to see the output of that. But equally beyond that, there are much more pragmatic and practical arguments around openness, that if everyone is able to access research that has been funded by charitable or by governmental organizations, you actually increase the return on investment by making that available to the maximum number of people, because people can build on that research, they can commercialize it, and they can develop cures for diseases, solutions for global warming and other grand challenges that we face as a species. And beyond even that, then we also have an ongoing replication crisis in a great deal of science, and openness, again, can help with that. And this goes beyond just open access. This goes on to open science, and so we can look at open protocols, we can look at open research data, and all of these things can solve and can help move us forwards as both a species and as societies. But there are lots and lots of different ways that you can achieve those. There is one route, as we've already seen. There are multiple different business models that can be used to achieve this. And beyond business models, there are multiple different approaches to open access. So if we can have the next slide, please. And I'm going to teach everyone to suck eggs because I think it's worth pointing out. The main approaches that funders have adopted: gold, green, public access. I've included public access because it's sort of open access, although technically not, because it's not liberally licensed, and so it fails the definition as put in place by the BOAI. But gold, favoured by the UK, probably the first really big country to adopt a very pro-gold open access policy, and that was post the Finch report in 2012. At around about the same time, 26 miles away across the English Channel, France, on the other hand, decided to adopt a self-archiving route, and one of their major funders started building AL, which is a national green open access repository. And at around about the same time, in 2013, in the Holdren memo, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US defined public access, where everything had to be put in a repository but didn't have to be liberally licensed, and so on. So there is a highly heterogeneous landscape around open access when you look at funders. And even when we break these down, gold, green, and public access, there are many, many subdivisions of how you can implement each of these. And funders don't operate in isolation of one another. Going back to Vanessa's point about her fellow postdoc who is going to be challenged by working with the CDC in the future. Funder policies do not necessarily match up with one another. This is something that a librarian from Imperial College in the UK refers to as policy stack, where you have multiple different policy requirements that may be at odds with one another. And this makes things very difficult. Next slide, please. So this is, and my apologies, I will go into explain why some of this isn't an accurate representation. I took this data from RawMap, which is an open registry of mandates and open access policies that includes a listing for funders. And what we can see here is a map of the globe where I've picked out groups of nations based on the type of predominant policy that they have. So you can see in Western Europe, gold open access tends to be the predominant approach towards open access. In the United States, I'm including green as like public access as a form of green OA, that green open access is dominant. And in China and Australia and Canada and South Africa, it's mixed. There are funders that either are fairly non-committal and agnostic on route to open access, or just have conflicting depending on different funders within regions. So there are funders in Australia that are very pro open access through the gold route, and there are funders that in Australia that are very pro open access through the green route. Even within that, if we look at South America has, through legislation, sorry, just go back, through legislation has green open access requirements, but also has an incredibly vibrant gold open access infrastructure in place through groups like Scielo and Redalyc. So even where you're looking at a national level, it's still not as simple as it could be. So what to do? Next slide, please. So what I thought I'd do is I'd take a quick look at how different approaches are working. And so I'm going to look at green and gold. And so my exemplar of a primarily and historically gold open access route is Coalition S. So primarily European funders, but some from global funders as well. And this is data taken from Digital Science Dimensions, which is a database that tracks articles, and you can break out the articles by open access or closed access type. And so in this, we can see that between 2014 and 2022, they've seen really significant increases in gold open access and a decline in closed access. They've seen growth in hybrid. The decline in closed is probably understated in this because the embargo period that is associated with closed articles probably means that the closed article for 2022 is higher than it should be. And if you look back at this in a year's time, so this looks like a success to me. This looks like it is moving the needle towards a more open access future. What about green open access? And so next slide. So this is the United States, which has a long-standing green open access policy, albeit only for funders with budgets of over $100 million a year, but certainly for groups like the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, for groups like the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, and so on. They have seen in green open access a fairly solid amount of green open access. They've also seen, because some funders do support APCs through their granting programs, an increase in gold open access. And if we look at the decline in closed access, again, in 2022, that increase in closed access is probably actually not real. It's probably an artifact of the fact that there is an embargo period that is permissible under the existing rules. The US is actually going to change that as of 2026, all being well. The Holdren memo will be consigned to history and will be replaced by the Nelson memo, which was published last year. And that means that green open access will be mandated on an immediate basis. And so it's likely that artifacts of that nature won't be seen anymore. So different systems, they work, but they're fundamentally not compatible with one another. Green open access, in order to fund the things that journals do, requires subscriptions to continue. Gold open access denies a continuation of subscription. And if we have a highly heterogeneous world where there are different funders and consequently different publishers behaving in different ways, we can't possibly realize the economies of scale because we're running two parallel systems. Next slide here, please. So what next? And it seems like there is some hope here, I would suggest. Coalition S is continuing down its route supporting gold, but is adding in additional options. And so is beginning to look at green open access on similar terms to the Nelson memo, so immediate open access at the point of publication. But at the same time, they're also looking at some of the other big issues associated with gold open access. So looking at how can we address issues around global equity? And Romy spoke at the start around some of the projects around differential pricing that are being looked at by Coalition S at the moment. So researchers in the Global South and in those that have less funding available to them will have a different price from those who are highly funded researchers at research-intensive institutions. Coalition S are also looking to seek to support scholar-led infrastructure as well, and so that would be university presses and things of that nature potentially. As well as looking to support zero embargo green open access approaches. Now, the questions around that then start to be, does that entrench subscriptions? Or does that drive publishers to various options, such as the only way that you can immediately place an article in a repository is if you pay an APC, which then entrenches APC-driven open access potentially. And so there may well be some unforeseen consequences with all of this. And similarly in the United States, where I spoke about the Nelson memo replacing the Holdren memo, and the immediacy of green open access from 2026, there's currently some questions around whether or not that will actually happen, because politics and the House Appropriations budget potentially not supporting that memo. So it's a confusing place, is basically what I'm saying. But I'm sure there will be questions, and I will do my best to answer. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different models, and I feel sorry for Vanessa, how is a researcher supposed to know this journal is subscribed to open and I don't need to pay anything if, you know, in January it has met all the targets, this one is gold, this one is, you have all these different, and there's not really an official place where everyone keeps all their journals up to date with all their prices and all their options, is there? I know it's what we're kind of trying to do at Corners Up, but getting everyone on board is really, really hard in terms of the data. So yeah, how can we make this easier? I mean, for researchers, it's clear that there's going to be different models and they kind of complement each other in some ways and they get us in the right direction. But in the meantime, yeah, are we confusing researchers too much with more models?
I'm happy to come in here quick. Oh, do you want to
go for it? Yeah,
I guess my thoughts around this are, this is sort of a problem for the scholarly communications to solve in the service of authors. I think when we think about a future where more and more journals are open access, we're kind of in this transitional phase where everything is more complex and it's more difficult. But from the author's perspective, the ideal is that Vanessa can go to any journal and not have to think about what model is facilitating open access, that in a way they're all open access. They might be subscribed to open, they might be under transformative agreement, but from the author perspective, that shouldn't matter. And I think that's what we should be going towards for our authors. But it's going to take us a little while to get there in between, because it is complex. And yeah.
And I think that has been recognized by research funders as well. Certainly one of Coalition S's very earliest policies around Plan S was the idea that there shouldn't be a burden on researchers in terms of administering payment, and that should be organized either by the research funder or by the parent institution of a researcher. And I think that makes a huge amount of sense, that we shouldn't be, you know, distracting researchers' time and placing it onto administrative tasks rather than doing the research that, you know, potentially benefits mankind.
But even with funder, you know, policies or funders that work with a centralized organization that deals with it, there's still that kind of crossover. Yes, I'll pay for fully away, but actually you could go hybrid with transformative agreements. These kind of different routes don't really talk to each other. There's not the kind of, one is your institution, the other is your funder, and that's where researchers get caught in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's not really
yeah, I think that's a very hard circle for publishers to square, because often even within an organization, that information isn't necessarily held in a single place. You know, there may be multiple different, both practical, like workflow driven, as well as like contractual requirements around different agreements. So squaring that circle can be hard, I'm sure, for all publishers, I'm sure.
Yeah. Next I'll go to AJ with a question. You've came up with your model 3 years ago. Has anyone implemented it? Are any publishers receptive to what you've come up with?
Not so far. I've talked to a few different publishers recently. Yeah, not yet.
And Sarah, Chris,
I was going to follow up with a question actually for AJ on his model, if that's all right. Yeah, I guess I'm curious about how you view the advantages of the model over, say, subscribe to open. I guess they're both at the institutional level,
Yeah.
supporting sort of open access for everyone. So yeah, I think that I was curious on that. And then also, because it seems like your model is predicated sort of the pricing being linked to usage more. So you could almost create a hybrid model where you use the framework of subscribe to open, but use usage to base the pricing for the institutions as a possibility. But yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on sort of how you view those two different models and the overlap and advantages of one versus the other.
That's a great question, Sarah. Thank you. So when I first thought of Read and Let Read, it was around the time that the University of California had signed their big transformative agreement with Elsevier, and there was a lot of pushback against that. And I saw a lot of pushback, but I didn't see any sort of like alternatives. And so I thought, like, what would an alternative look like? So that's kind of how I thought of it. And I think it's funny you mentioned subscribe to open, because if I think back on it, there's some thinking that goes into subscribe to open that is in this model. I think subscribe to open is a great model, but like you said, it really depends on the institutions. It depends on really the authors that publish in that year. So you will go open access if you are published in a year that makes, and if not, I'm not exactly sure what the process is for opening up the back catalog of content that's still paywalled. So I like S2O a lot, but trying to figure out how to do that back catalog is I think one of the strengths of Read and Let Read. I think so. Publishing, we've been publishing for decades or centuries, and so there's every year we get more and more that's published in a year open access. There's a huge chunk of backlog that's not open access and doesn't really have any sort of, you can't put a funder can't put their thumb on anything to make that open access. And even if you could compel an author to do that, there's no really how would you even get in contact with that author? So something about, I'm just kind of throwing ideas out here, but thinking about the push for the rights retention strategy, where you would have the author retain their rights in order to do something with it, like deposits. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you may retain your rights, but that doesn't mean you have to do anything with that. Where was I going with this? Oh, but B, so the decades and decades of published materials where the author has already transferred the rights to the publisher, if you did Read and Let Read, the publisher has it within their power to make that open access because they're the copyright holder.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of the models now that we focus on is going forward, what are we going to do with new publishing? How are we going to make that open, but less so looking at the back catalog? Because one of the things you said earlier was like the subscription model is continued because libraries keep paying for subscriptions. And I think when I started working in open access, I used to think, well, what if they all just stop, the kind of moment when everyone is canceling Elsevier, like, yeah, why don't you just cancel it and use your money to pay for publishing? But that also wouldn't solve the problem of what's already been done. That might solve the problem going forward. But you seem to like to pay for subscriptions at your university. Is that your library?
I'm neutral towards it. I just know it's a fact. Like, I'm not gonna stop it. And if we stop paying publishers, like, they wouldn't be able to publish works, and so that just, you're cutting off outlets for authors. The other thing about being at this kind of school that I'm at, where we're mostly teaching undergrads, like, we can put as much stuff into green repositories as possible, but students that we're funneling into look at this stuff and get used to it, it's hard enough to get us to have them go through like the publisher system to begin with, let alone to like say, okay, if you can't get it at the publisher, then copy the DOI, go to Google Scholar and paste it in, then show all the different articles, and then one of them is going to have a PDF. We're like, there's from the student's perspective, I think it's kind of important to still make those publisher copies accessible, just to kind of get them used to what that looks like. And some people prefer, some researchers prefer to look at the version of record. I do what I can here at Murray State to make sure that we have green copies available for researchers who have the sophistication to seek out those copies and understand the differences. But there's still a huge audience that's just 5 levels beyond.
So you think green in general is just not good enough as a mechanism?
I think it's good. I think like any of the mechanisms we've talked about, they're all good. They're just none of them are good enough. It's not that I think green in particular is not good enough. It's none of these are good enough.
I wonder if we can like let Vanessa speak. She's so quiet, and hear a little bit of her perspective on reading content. You didn't really talk about that. You talked about the publishing experience, but not any issues you might have with accessing content. I wonder if there's some stuff you can share.
Yeah, sure, I can. It's been really interesting. I have a few questions, but I just wanted to listen. I spent the first 2 years after my PhD working for the government in Palau, it's a small Pacific Island nation. And I wasn't affiliated with the university. And then I started my first postdoc, which also wasn't affiliated with the university. And so was the second postdoc. So I kind of had a bit of an unusual path, but I still was doing research and still wanted to access papers. And it was a real pain in the ass because, sorry for that term, but you're used to having access since your undergraduate days, and all of a sudden you're not part of that prestigious club anymore. And that's also when I started to really appreciate open access papers, of course. But it was difficult, and then you write to a colleague who's at a university and say, could you send me this paper? But it might take them a few days to get back to you, or you get an out of office reply. I'm in the field for the next 6 months. Or some colleagues would hand us their login details for libraries. But yeah, things like that are tricky, I think, for researchers. And I still get lots of people writing to me because I've published with people in developing countries, and so we've published in subscription journals. And every week I get requests for my papers. So it also takes time to send all this stuff. I mean, it's not a lot at the moment, but then as you add it up over the years, but I think for the public even more so, because they don't even have that undergrad training of how to find articles, right? So it really has to be much easier to do. And scientists often get frustrated that our work is not considered enough or taken into account in policy making and so on. But we really then owe it to the people who should be accessing it that they can access it easily. And I think Chris was talking about return on investment, and that was actually a point I wanted to make earlier. That for us researchers, it's also a much better return on investment. Often we work on these papers for free because we've long used up all our funding and we still want to get the research out. So it's free labor, and then the reviewers review it for free, and then it's behind a paywall. So the open access is really much more rewarding in that sense. At least you get your research out and it can be cited quickly and disseminated to everyone. Yeah, that's nice. And I was wondering if I can just ask a quick question to AJ, because I was thinking, so Romy was asking you, how would the read and let read model work for someone like me with this funder requirement? And you said we could still have the option of having it immediately open access. But if not all of the articles are open access immediately, it wouldn't qualify again because it has to be called open access, right? And so I was thinking, well, then really funders will have to make a switch and probably become a bit more flexible. And then that led me to think, what are the main, I don't know, I guess sort of blockages you've encountered or doubts from people or, pushback when you try to promote this model? What are the issues people see with it? Maybe some of them are warranted and some might not be, but what do you think prevents uptake of the model?
Yeah, so the read and let read model, it's purely at the level between the library and the publisher and the subscription package they have. So we don't have to go out and tell authors that this has happened. We don't have to tell policy people that this has happened. One day, a year after the model goes into play, when you go to click on something from that publisher, it's available to you regardless if you're logged in through an institution or not. I think if you got it to a fully optimized place, I think it could allow policy funders to think a little bit more flexibly about their policies, because suddenly I know the biggest, so like, you want things to be open access, like you want it to be like to check all the marks of what it means to be open access, to be openly licensed, all that good stuff. But what the real issue is, the where the rubber meets the road, is just being able to read something without any sort of barrier. So that's what I want to address, is just making sure that if you want to read it, you can read it. And then you open a pathway to get those extra fringe things like getting the license, the Creative Commons license on it. But right here in the here and now, just want you to be able to read it, regardless of who you are or where you are.
Yeah, thanks. That's clear now. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of workflows and getting it set up for a publisher, I guess if it's between the library and the publisher, it's a calculation mechanism of what you will pay, similar to the manual kind of demand driven. You pay up front a deposit, and then later we look at your usage and we determine like how much you've actually used. Whereas they just open up the access, and then on hindsight you could look overall and retrospectively make articles open access if they hit a certain threshold, and if they haven't been paid for by a funder through the gold model, for example. That's roughly it. Did I get that right?
Pretty much. It's like DDA on steroids. Yeah.
Let's subscribe to open per article. That's something DDA subscribe to open on an article level, isn't it? Yeah. But what about those that are not linked to an institution? Would they still get read access that haven't negotiated something with a publisher, and the institution isn't paying anything?
So if a school uses 5,000 articles a year, you would pay for 10,000 articles for the next year. And let's say your school uses roughly 5,000, but they don't use the other 5,000. In that next year, you put all that other 5,000 onto the web for anyone to read. So kind of like when you read a New York Times article and you don't have a subscription, you make an account and you get free access. Or JSTOR, they give you 100 free articles. So Royal Society of Chemistry could, let users unaffiliated create an account, and they can read, 50 or 100 articles, whatever number you want to come up with. And it's already been paid for by somebody.
But that mechanism you would need to build in a kind of access management perspective.
You would, but knowing that all the commercial newspapers and JSTOR have already done it, it shouldn't be too, you're going to have to do some work, but it's not like you're creating something from scratch.
Yeah, I guess when we prepped for this, I was thinking about who drives which model, and you have the whole kind of transformative agreements idea, which has come from the kind of library consortia side and has then been pushed onto the poor publishers who have to come up with all the workflows, and you have to make it better. So I think there's sometimes a little bit of a mismatch with new models and how you actually make it work. Whereas some models like subscribe to open, that was publisher instigated, wasn't it?
I think, but it is beauty and it's beautifully simple, right? Subscribe to open in that it sort of uses existing infrastructure and setup. So you can just leverage those, that you need very little additional infrastructure, where certainly transformative agreements have complicated the landscape greatly.
Yeah.
We've had to develop systems to administer them, to check, the individual APCs that are linked. So yeah, and it sounds like this would certainly involve some level of development of sort of a platform that could support the model.
We just really need a publisher that's bold in their vision and ready to be a leader in the space and do everything they can for equitable access. I don't know who that would be, but just throwing it out into the universe.
Are you tempted, Sarah?
I have
Going,
many more
going.
questions, which I'm sure we don't have time for, but
Brilliant. Oh, we've actually gone over time. Oh my God. I completely lost track. But yeah, I think we're going to wrap up because we've gone over. Thank you all so much for contributing to the discussion. We've had a comment from Stuart, which I think we'll get to, and I think it's more of a comment. I think AJ, you have already seen it. I saw you smile when it popped up. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions, I'll put the speaker emails at the end. If you want to be kept up to date with forthcoming events and our newsletter, please feel free to join that. We've got one more webinar this year about AI for a better user experience. And here are our speaker details. If you have any more questions for Vanessa, AJ, Sarah, or Chris, please feel free to get in touch. Or if you have any questions for me. So thanks very much. Thank you all, my lovely speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Romy.
it was good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone
Bye.
else.